Please send my regards.
And Aissia Richardson. Voices
You know
of
what I'm
change
talking
is to
about,
connect,
Aissia?
inform, and empower people
Yeah,
to engage
great.
in social political change. Right here on Usala Radio. World news, local politics, saving money and investing, all this and more right here on Usala Radio. Your voice, your radio.
With your co-hosts, Aissia Richardson and Leslie Acosta. Leslie's off today, and I was brought in a couple of friends to help co-host. Lisa Rhodes from the PA Democratic Black Caucus, she's the chairperson, and Carol Rhodes, an education expert. Today, the title of the show is Rage, Resistance, Resilience, and Resolution. And I'm so excited to have a guest here, Nijmie Dzurinko. Nijmie and I actually go way, way back. We served on the community funding board for Bread and Roses Community Fund way back in the aughts, probably. And so Nijmie is a wonderful activist, and she is the Southeast Pennsylvania chair, or the Pennsylvania chair for the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah, so, Pennsylvania chair, and yeah, a member of the National Steering Committee as well.
So, Nijmie, do you want to, I asked you to come on to talk a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign and the platform of the Poor People's Campaign. And we are in this incredible, I'm calling it pandemic and pandemonium, because we have this incredible, virus that's been raging the world. And I think it's endemic of what is going on in the world in terms of the crisis that of poverty. And so the Poor People's Campaign had been planned way before any of the the pandemic started. But the platform is very similar to what's going on with folks who've been protesting. So if you could talk a little bit about that platform, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is addressing 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, poverty, environmental devastation, the war economy or militarism, and the distorted moral narrative of white supremacist Christian nationalism. That distorted moral narrative supports all the other 4. So, and I'm sure that many people tuning in know that the Poor People's Campaign was the last thing that MLK did before he was assassinated. He was really following the lead of the National Welfare Rights Organization, led by Black women, that were pushing him and others in the civil rights movement to look at issues of poverty. And so that is what kind of led him to make this pivot from civil rights to human rights, from what he called a period of reform to a period of revolution in his assessment. And so 50 years later, in 2018, we reignited the movement. But there was a lot of work before that happened, really 10 years in the lead up to relaunching the campaign. The 2 national co-coordinating organizations, the Kairos Center and Repairers of the Breach, were working right through the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina with Bishop William Barber, and through the Kairos Center at Union Theological Seminary, where I was trained through something called the Poverty Scholars Program that started in 2005 and made the call to reignite the Poor People's Campaign in 2008. And that program was bringing together organizations of the working class, poor and dispossessed, across the country for study of liberation theology, for study of political economy, for building relationships, and for immersing ourselves in conditions throughout the country. So that's really what's led to this current moment. And as you said, this is the time with everything that's happening, the pandemic, state violence, police violence, the global economic crisis. These are all things that are coming together in this moment.
So, I follow you on Facebook, and you have put some incredible posts on Facebook. And one of them was around this issue of the nonprofit industrial complex. I really love that one. And then the one that you did yesterday was about this issue of the base of the base supporting itself. And so I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I think that issue of the base supporting itself is fundamental to the work that needs to be done to look at all of the things that protesters right now are talking about, which is re-evaluating our priorities, right? So could you talk a little bit about that post that you did? And then we're going to go into Lisa and talking about the issue of defunding the police. And then Denise, I would like for you to talk about what it means to take police officers out of our education system and put vice principals and put supports back into our schools, librarians, counselors, things like that. So if you could talk a little bit about that issue of the base, and then Lisa, if we could go into the defund terminology.
Sure. So my post was about just a fundamental way that this society is set up, and really the entire world, right? It's set up on a basis of capitalism, racialized capitalism, that is structured around the private ownership of the means of production and distribution, and the drive to maximize profit at all costs, profit above human life, profit above the earth. And so that's the basis of society. That's the basis of the situation that we're in. And so the laws, the politics, the ideology, the religion, the culture, everything else is kind of built upon that foundation, upon that base. And so what I was trying to get out of my post is that one of the reasons why change is so difficult, right? Why we still, after, the initial uprising in Ferguson, 6 years later, we're still in this place of Black people are still being murdered disproportionately by the police. We are facing a situation where 40 million people in this country just applied for unemployment and are being thrown out of work and being thrown off of healthcare. And so, my post was getting at the fact that we try to pass laws, we try to, implement policies, we work to get folks elected. Those are all important things to do. But until we change that fundamental base, and this is what MLK was talking about when he was talking about, we actually have to fundamentally restructure society. He said, an edifice that is built upon just flinging a coin to a beggar instead of actually changing the structure, it needs to be restructured, right? And so until we restructure that foundation, until we restructure that base, we're still going to have the same symptoms kind of recurring all the time, right? He said, an accurate diagnosis, an accurate prescription rests upon an accurate diagnosis of the disease. So what is our diagnosis of the fundamental problem, right, is something that we have to grapple with. And in the Poor People's Campaign, we're talking about the fact that we can't address systemic racism without addressing poverty, without addressing the war economy, right, without addressing our role as the U.S. in the entire world, and how we take the wealth that's created by the workers of this country and we use it to dominate internationally, right? We have 800 military bases in countries around the entire world, right, as the U.S. So we can't separate systemic racism from poverty, from the war economy, from environmental devastation. And when we look at all those issues together, what we understand is it will require fundamental restructuring of society, right? And that is what King saw and others saw 50 years ago. They saw that coming 50 years ago. So we're just trying to catch up to what they understood at that point. And that was one of the reasons that he was assassinated is that he was starting to question the fundamental structures of this society, and that was seen as very threatening. Not only questioning the fundamental structures of the society, but uniting poor people across lines of division. This is the other place that he went that a lot of people around him weren't ready to go. He pulled together, a meeting of folks from Appalachia, Chicanos from the Southwest, indigenous folks, Black folks from the cities and from the South. He pulled together all of these people and he said, hey, we need to start something. We need to start a poor people's campaign. And that is incredibly threatening, right? The unity of the bottom in this country is something that the ruling class has always, always, always tried to prevent from happening. And so that is what the Poor People's Campaign really represents, is 140 million people in this country, by our estimations, that are poor or near poor. If you look at 200% of the federal poverty line, you've got 140 million people, almost half of the country. This isn't something that we often talk about. We can have tunnel vision here in Philadelphia and other cities, thinking that this is just a Philadelphia issue, or that it's really about Philadelphia versus the rest of the state. And through organizing statewide in Pennsylvania, what I know, and I also come from Westmoreland County, out in southwestern PA, even though I've been living in Philadelphia for over 25 years, is that people across the state are very much hurting. And although there are differences and we are divided and conquered, we have been exploited and oppressed in different ways, there are a lot of things that we have in common, and we do have a basis for coming together and building a common agenda. And there's my kitty. And so, that's really what we're trying to do here in the Pennsylvania Poor People's Campaign. And we have folks in the campaign from over 50 of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania.
Excellent, excellent. So, Lisa, why don't you take it away with this issue of defunding the police and essentially demilitarizing, how we deal with crime and punishment here in Pennsylvania and in the U.S.
Sure. So, everybody knows that George Floyd is one of many African American men who has died at the hands of the police. And so we finally got to a point where enough is enough. And a lot of people are saying that this is like our second civil rights movement that is now occurring. So we started talking about what to do. Now it's finally, how to enact legislation that will impact, the way we view, interact, and, with the police. And so there's been 3 subjects that's come up, which was defund, dissolve or disband, or reform. And, Pennsylvania, has to make a decision about which one they're going to support, and specifically Philadelphia. And so I said that maybe what we want to do is start by defining what are those 3 categories, because there's a lot of buzz and confusion about what defund means versus disband or dissolve, for instance. And so we were talking about examples of defunding is when, the city does not give the police department additional money. So, for example, here in Philadelphia, Mayor Kenney did not give the police department the additional $14 million that he was slated to give them. That he said that some of that money was going to be used for body cameras. But now body cameras are becoming the norm and a necessity and a requirement. So he said he would get the money from elsewhere. So people are saying that, when you talk about defunding, it doesn't necessarily always mean taking money away. It means reallocating and or not giving additional is how most people are defining it now. And when you start talking about dissolve or disband, the best example that I could give is what they did in Camden, New Jersey. So in Camden, there was so much corruption in the police department that even the police chief said that he agreed with disbanding the whole organization because the corruption was so rampant. And as we also know, Camden had one of the highest rates of crime and murder, even compared to Philadelphia. So once they disbanded it, he actually reapplied for his job, as well as I think they rehired a total of 100 police that were former police officers for their system. And so now their crime has actually dropped approximately by 50%. And people are just in amazement of how, that model actually worked. And I think they did it approximately, 7 years ago. And now they're saying that what they have done is implemented partnerships with the community and having barbecues with the community. The police are going and knocking on doors and literally forming partnerships. And that was a major part of how they disbanded and reorganized. So moving on, when you talk about reform, we're talking about keeping the system that you have in place, but implementing new and innovative ideas that will hopefully add equity and parity when it comes to dealing with people of color. And so that includes cultural diversity training, implicit bias training, which is something that really needs to be emphasized, psych evals, ongoing psych and behavioral health professionals being introduced. So, reform, again, has many, many facets to that, and it all depends on the individual state and or city of how they incorporate that. But, one of the things that we're doing legislatively here in Pennsylvania, when we were talking to yesterday, Rep. Rab, he has House Bill 1666, which would create basically a database that any police officer or anyone of the police in the police entity would have any infractions, that it would be placed in this database, and that if he or she would go to be rehired in another system, another agency, that they would be required to check the database to see what the infraction was, and if they decided to still hire the police officer, that they had to give 14-day notice of why they're still going to hire them when they have this red flag on their record. So, that way people can't say, oh, we didn't know, or, it's always a lot of excuses. So, there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion on what model would be the best model for us. And there's a lot of discussion on if it's reform, which is where it's leaning, what does that mean and what would it include? So that's kind of like the summary.
So talk a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign's platform regarding justice and police violence.
Sure. So you can check out all the Poor People's Campaign platform and demands at poorpeoplescampaign.org. And in general, the Poor People's Campaign actually really stands for demilitarization, right? Which defunding the police is one component. But we're looking at the entire military-industrial complex. And policing is a part of that, right? Because policing has actually become militarized in this country. There's military-grade weapons. We can see it, every day. The policing system has become militarized. Our police are trained by military in other countries. There's Israeli military training our police in some instances. So we want to look at the overall picture of militarization, which has an international dimension, right? We're looking at, the issue of poverty, systemic racism, the war economy, environmental devastation. They're honestly really global issues. They connect the poor and dispossessed working class in this country with the poor and dispossessed around the world. And it's very important that we recognize that because of the role that the U.S. state plays in the world. The same state that is oppressing and exploiting us, that's killing our people in the streets, that's imposing economic sanctions against the poor through defunding social welfare programs, is also doing economic sanctions against other countries that are hurting poor and dispossessed people around the world. So we have to look at the international dimension, but we stand for demilitarization. We stand for moving resources from a war economy to a peace economy, right? To investing in human needs. So it's very aligned with many of the things that are being lifted up right now, but I would just also add that it's defunding the police, it's also defunding the military and shifting those resources elsewhere, because we know that, the massive, multi-trillion dollars going into military budgets, it's not going to rank and file soldiers in the military. It's going to weapons contractors. It's going to private contractors. It's going to pay for unbelievably expensive, the development of weapons of war, selling of arms. So that entire emphasis of society needs to be reorganized and reinvested. So I think that lines up really well with the calls for de-investing in policing, but we also have to look at the overall picture of militarization as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The House of Representatives put forward a platform that focused in on justice reform, but they did not include demilitarization of the police. So I just thought that was telling that it didn't deal with the structural issues. It dealt with the policy issues, but not that structural reform. So Denise is an education expert. And so I wanted Denise to come in and talk about what would the possibilities be if we could shift that funding from the militarization into our public school system.
So it's very interesting how all of these topics are so interconnected. Simply because when we begin to talk about de-investing in police and militarization, and I heard you say that we're not looking at like root causes, just addressing things on a policy level, that is very true for education as well. Because what happens is when we start looking at ways to deconstruct systemic racism, education is at the core. One of the questions that Lisa has been asking for the last couple of years to policymakers and people in positions of power is, why is Masterman the only blue ribbon school in the city of Philadelphia that goes from, I guess, grade 6 to grade 12? And why is it not possible for us to replicate the programs that are at Masterman so that we can address, many of the very gifted and talented students who are here in our city? And so every time Lisa asks the question, she never really gets an answer. And so as an educator, I'm very blessed and fortunate to surround myself with family and friends who always ask the hard questions. And, of course, the 3 R's are important: reading, writing, and arithmetic. But when you start delving into beyond what goes on in the classroom, we see that education is really a middle-class construct. And thus the reason why it's so poor in the United States is because, tying right into the Poor People's Campaign, is not properly funded. When Lisa started asking the question, I started looking into like the history of education in Philadelphia and found that Central High School is the oldest public school, not just in the city, but in the state. It was founded in 1836. And then I started looking at the oldest schools in the state and selected Episcopal Academy because we're familiar with Episcopal. So Episcopal Academy is the 8th oldest school in the state. And Episcopal was founded in 1746. So there's like a 50-year difference between the 8th oldest school in the state and private school and the oldest public school in the state, which is Central. And so looking a little bit deeper, Central didn't have its first African-American graduate until the 1940s, which means that there was like over a 100-year difference between when the school was founded and when it had its first African-American graduate. And if we look at, at a broader scope, it was like a 200 to 300 year difference between the time an African-American graduate of the oldest high school in the city was graduated versus the time that formal education was established in the state of Pennsylvania. And so when you start looking at that construct, which is like a middle class construct, because Central was founded for the middle class of Philadelphia, who maybe could not afford to send their children to private school. Central, Girl Side, and Masterman, the three oldest schools here in the city, were all established for middle class children. And so therefore, they have a tradition that they've been able to uphold since they were established in 1800. And the rest of the schools just don't get the type of funding, the type of recognition, and the type of instruction that those three schools continue to receive. And so while it seems like, we talk about equity in education and all schools should be funded the same and all school districts should be funded the same, because where Philadelphia receives maybe $10,000 per pupil, Montgomery County may receive $15,000 per pupil, and other counties may receive more per pupil in the state of Pennsylvania. The equity is not there for the funding. We know in Philadelphia, there's been cries about the asbestos in the building, about students going to school where there's no heat, about old and outdated materials. And all of that has to do with racism. The systemic racism that not just the city and not just the state, but this country has been built upon, that says that poor people aren't worthy of the same types of goods and services that the middle class and the wealthy receive. And so, Lisa asked about counselors, and this is very relevant because this conversation just took place yesterday. And I said to her, when the counselors were cut and the schools thought that they could operate with no counselor and no vice principal, the alumni of those three schools got together for the individual school and they purchased a counselor. The alumni purchased a vice principal. And so they sort of operate the same way that private schools operate, in that they have strong alumni associations who still support the schools. Whereas if you were to look at a school like West Philly High School, a school like Fitzsimons High School, which has since been closed, a school like Mastbaum High School, where the students are just regular neighborhood students, often who fall below the poverty line. Most receive the free lunch program. They don't have that same type of support. So, all of this is interrelated, even when it comes down to policing and demilitarizing the police department. When you look at the way a lot of students who have been labeled as bad or disruptive are handled, they're handled differently at the neighborhood high schools than they are at Central. Even when it comes down to the uniform requirement, students at Central aren't required to wear uniforms to school. At other high schools, if the students don't wear uniforms, then they receive some type of penalty, whether the penalty is a detention, or the penalty may be suspension, or they may be sent home to change their clothes. So right here within our city, there's disparity in the way students are instructed, the materials that they have to utilize, as well as just, socially, the way they're treated. And, when we start talking about the poor people's movement and how all of this affects everyone, it affects everyone in every aspect of life, particularly in education.
So Nijmie has this incredible background, not only coming from another part of the state, which there are so many linkages between the rural parts of the state and the urban parts of the state that deal with health disparities, that deal with health deserts, again, that deal with poverty. And so one of the things that Nijmie did before joining the Poor People's Campaign was she ran the Philadelphia Student Union. And so she's uniquely qualified and uniquely placed to be able to not talk from her own experiences, but from the experiences of the young people that were organized as part of the Philadelphia Student Union. So I think that that issue around education disparity, and particularly in our magnet schools versus our neighborhood schools, Nijmie worked with young people in all of our schools, and she knew, that they all wanted the same thing. They all wanted to have, books. They wanted libraries. They wanted counselors. They fought against Paul Vallis when he wanted to put the police officers in all the schools. And so, the young people, are there are voices of the future. So, so this around education and quality public education, I think is foundational to helping us move from the way our education system was created, which was really agrarian, right? It was really created to help farmers be better farmers, right? And so as we move into the future, our education system, that reevaluation, that restructuring also is something that I'm sure that Nijmie is qualified to talk about.
Is that my cue? Yeah, no, I really appreciate everything that's been said and very much agree. And, when I was at the Philadelphia Student Union for almost 10 years, first as an organizer and assistant director, and then later came back as the executive director. And, when we were engaged in this work, it's still true, right? That what we learned is that 474 out of 501 school districts in Pennsylvania are underfunded. So, it is a very widespread issue, and a big part of it, like my colleague said, is baked into the system through the structure, right? The structural racism and systemic poverty, and the connection between funding of schools and property taxes. I mean, there you go, right there, right? Schools funded by property taxes means that, what do we have a history of this country? We have a history of residential segregation, right? What is the housing policy and the history of housing policy in this country? You can't look at what's going on with education without understanding that. And that is directly related to how our schools are funded in the entire structure, right? And so, that means that the area that you live in will determine the amount of funding for your schools. And that entire structure is an inequitable structure. And so even now, folks that are advocating for education not to be connected to property taxes or to end property taxes that go to education, I mean, that makes sense, but we have to have a different way of structuring the funding for education. I agree that it shouldn't be based on those taxes, but we have to have a completely different way of funding education. I think that what is happening now in education also is connected to the fact that we have to look at the larger system of the economy, because remember, young people are being educated in this system to go into the workforce or to not go into the workforce, right? There's a lot of changes happening in the economy and the structure of the economy and the structure of the workforce over the last period of time. And if you look and see what kinds of jobs are being created, I think we all know this. The kinds of jobs that are being created are low-wage jobs. They're precarious jobs. It's not a situation in which the jobs that are available are long-term, family-sustaining career jobs with benefits. Those aren't the kinds of jobs that are really out there for the most part. And in this economic crisis, pandemic, we're seeing that so many jobs have gone away, and it's estimated that almost 50% of those jobs aren't coming back. Now, this isn't good news. It's not good news. It's not hopeful news. The thing that we have to really understand is, what kind of crisis are we really looking at, and how do we organize to meet that crisis and to move through that crisis? And I think that this is a real thing for us to look at, is that this is for the folks who are running this society, the fact that we have been in a pandemic, the fact that we've been having to shelter in place and businesses have shut down and closed for the time being, is an opportunity for them. They've been trying to figure out how to shed workers. They've been trying to figure out how to reduce their workforce, how to introduce more automation, how to eliminate the cost of labor. That's what they've been trying to do. So don't kid yourself into thinking they're not going to use this opportunity to do that. That's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to try as much as possible not to bring as many jobs back as they possibly can. So we also have to understand how that's connected to education, right? There's no coincidence that over the last 40 years, the way that education has been defunded, the way that it's been privatized, is directly connected to the fact that we have surplus labor that they do not need. That's directly connected to the school to prison pipeline as well. I am glad that in Philadelphia, it seems like we're finally over the myth of privatization. I think that myth has finally been busted. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were in the thick of fighting against the idea that the solution to the problems in education was, like young white men like Scott Gordon of Mastery Charter School that had found some kind of magic pill to fix the education system if only we would let them take over schools and run them and do the same thing that, any corporation does, which is try to figure out how to minimize the cost of labor, right? And do things, for cheaper, and use real estate and use other mechanisms to sustain profitability. But I think that myth has finally been busted. I think at the time we were at the forefront of fighting so many fronts, fighting even in among the community about this issue of the privatization of schools. And I'm glad that we were, strong, and we made very strong in that position, because I think that myth has finally been busted, that it took the courage of young people over the course of many, many years to fight back against what was happening in their schools, for a lot of other people to start to realize that what they were saying was true.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of this conversation, and I want to go back to this issue of race and class, and I think that in 2016 it was David Mosenkis who did the systemic racial bias in the latest Pennsylvania school funding. So we know that the funding in the schools is based on race and poverty, right? The data is there, right? So having that data is really powerful, because it allows you to put it in front of an elected official and say, here, this is what you're doing, fix it, right? Fix it, fix the fundamental issue. But the other thing has to do with internalized oppression, right? Because there were parents that were calling for those uniforms, right? There were parents who love mastery, who love this system, right? But then there are also children who come out and they're like, no, it didn't do what it was supposed to do. No, the regimentation was soul crushing, right? And so I think that part of this issue, which is why I think we need to still have these facilitated conversations about race, right? Because when you're calling for police to come in and make your neighborhood a police state, when you're calling for, because it was Black women who called on President Clinton to do something about the crime, and that's how the crime bill started, right? I mean, it was our own communities coming out and saying, to figure out, use the base to fix the base, which is crazy talk, right? So how in the Poor People's Campaign are you confronting our own internalized oppression?
Sure. So I think that it's definitely about internalized oppression, and I think it's also just about the fact that, this is the other point I'm trying to make with this base and superstructure conversation, is that, ideology is created by the ruling class. The ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. So we should never, we have to go easy on ourselves on one level and say it's understandable why people get caught up in these ideologies, whether you're on the left or you're on the right, whether you're getting your talking points from MSNBC and CNN, or whether you're getting your talking points from Fox News. Those are ideologies that are created by billionaires, quite frankly, right? And so it's not surprising that people play into it, that people are, it's a massive, massive, massive industry to create the mental terrain in this country. So I don't, so I don't want to be hard on people, but I do think it's a question of leadership development, right? It's a question, and that's where the organizing comes in. And that's where, with the Poor People's Campaign, we know that it has to rest upon the militant organizations of the poor and dispossessed. We need organization. Our power flows from organization. It doesn't flow. I mean, over and over again, right? I mean, the people in power, and this happens in, Philly all the time. They'll pick a random person, right, or a couple people, and say, "Oh, here, come up and say this thing," and that's like, okay, so you got somebody to represent a certain viewpoint for you, but so what, right? Like, this is not about the we have to have a collective understanding, right? We have to have a collective process of leadership development. That's an ongoing process. There's a lot of things we have to unlearn and undo, right? And then we have to figure out how to move forward. And that can only happen in collectivity. It can only happen in organization. It has to be a very conscious process. And I think that's always been one of the challenges, in this work. And if we're talking about Philly, it's like, we've had that for students, but less so for the community, certainly when it comes to the question of education. So one of the things that propelled me to come from, working in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Student Union to thinking about statewide organizing with Put People First PA and the Pennsylvania Poor People's Campaign was this need to kind of broaden out to the full community, right? That it's young people, but it's also adults and it's elders. We actually have to bring everyone together, right, to really, really develop consciousness, to develop leadership, because we have to do that. They're not going to do it for us. The oppressor isn't going to give us the tools that we need to break out, right? Like, we have to figure out, how do we do that together, right? And how do we do it in a way that really challenges the structures of power and doesn't just reinforce it or replicate it, because it's confusing. It's very difficult to parse everything out. There's so much coming at us all the time. So unless we create the space to have a different kind of conversation and to be in community collectivity with each other and to do that over the long term, that's the only thing that helps our people actually get clear. Otherwise, you're just confused all the time. If you look at the media, you look at social media, you're getting 500 different messages every single day coming from different directions. How do you sort through all that? You can only do it if you're engaged in a process of leadership development.
So my question becomes, what methodology could be used to affect change? Because I love your ideas. I love the movement. But to be, full transparency, I have not really heard anything recently about the Poor People's Campaign. And so, when you start dealing with the general population, how do people actually connect? Because, you're very right about everything that you said, particularly about schools like Mastery and how people's mindsets are fixed when it comes to what they think is best. But I think what happens is when people are desperate and they don't know which way to turn, whatever voice is the loudest is the one that they often go with, instead of trying to deconstruct what the message is and whether or not it would actually be effective for what they want to do.
Great. Well, I love that question. I appreciate that, and I agree with you. And actually, we are taking action statewide and here in Philadelphia on Sunday. We have a car caravan that's about everybody's got a right to live. We declare Jubilee. You can meet us at 13th and Washington. We're going to be meeting up in a parking lot, putting the banners on our cars that talk about this demand for Jubilee, which includes things like canceling rent and mortgages. It includes things like ending state violence, freeing the vulnerable from incarceration right now during COVID, and ultimately freeing them all. Healthcare for all. This is what Jubilee means to us. And so we are doing this in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and northeastern Pennsylvania on Sunday at 2 p.m. And in Philadelphia, you can meet us at 13th and Washington, where we're gathering as we start the caravan. So we are taking action across the state. You can follow us at PA Poor People's Campaign on Facebook. You can sign up at poorpeoplescampaign.org to make sure that you're getting the emails and the messages from the national campaign and also from the Pennsylvania campaign. So there's a lot of ways to connect. I appreciate you asking that question. And in Pennsylvania, we are comprised of organizations of the poor and dispossessed. So the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration, for example, is on the coordinating committee of the PA Poor People's Campaign. Put People First PA, folks that work on different fronts of struggle, immigrant rights, mass incarceration, healthcare. We were the only organization during the fight, the only campaign during the fight to prevent them from defunding and taking away general assistance, who actually conducted civil disobedience in the Senate chamber. And we actually forced some of the Republicans to switch their votes, and we forced some of the Democrats who had said that they were in favor of general assistance to actually have to stand up and really fight for it, which is something that we don't think that they would have done without that pressure from the Poor People's Campaign. So we were the only campaign that, there were a lot of people advocating to stop the cut of general assistance. There were a lot of people doing, call-ins and sign-ups and stuff online. We actually went there and did civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience. And so, I just want to say that the Poor People's Campaign has been taking action throughout Pennsylvania for the last 2 years since we were relaunched.
Great.
Lisa, did you have a question before? Because we have about 10 minutes left, and so did you want to chime in?
Oh, I was trying to chime in a while ago, but I was so busy enjoying the conversation. I tell you, when you have all these alpha women on the line at the same time, but with a few things that were said that I was going to chime in on, and it's kind of going backwards, but when we were talking about education, and I was thinking when she said how about change, and the structure of the curriculum hasn't changed. When you talk about that jobs are being eliminated and the need for different types of jobs are coming about, but we're not teaching the children based off of need, right? And so we have the CTE program in schools, but we're not really doing as much or doing much with CTE or STEM, which is really kind of crazy because we know that's where the jobs are going to be. And then the other thing, we started talking about funding education and property tax. The first thing that popped into my head was gentrification and the 10-year tax abatement. So, and that impact that it actually has on, how much money will be funded to education, because the average cost of a house right now in the city, poor people can't afford to live in the city anymore, quite frankly. And then when you start talking about the 10-year tax abatement, that's like a whole show by itself. So that was the stuff.
Right. And I totally agree with you, because I said to one of our elected officials about 2 years ago, if you take 3 blocks on South Broad Street and repeal the tax abatement, the income from the property tax on those 3 blocks from those condominiums would solve the deficit for the school district. If you have, there's several $1 million condominiums on South Broad Street. Like the whole building may start at $500,000 and up, and the penthouse may run a couple of million. 2.3 million and astronomical prices like that. 3 blocks on South Broad Street could fund the entire school district of Philadelphia. And so the person with whom I was talking was appalled.
Oh.
Just simply appalled. Like, how? No. The tax abatement plan is great for Philadelphia, and it's providing jobs. And I'm like, jobs for whom?
Exactly.
And, it's our business is good for the business tax. And I said, well, how does that benefit the children of the school district of Philadelphia? So, he was about to just, I think if he could have punched me in my mouth, he would have. But that's neither here nor there. Like, you know, the structure that my colleague talked about definitely does not give any consideration to the poor and working class. And a lot of the growth that our city has been touting over the last decade has not benefited the poor and working class at all. Not at all. And so, you know, there's such disparity when we start talking about progress. It's like it all depends on your perspective and your place in life, how progressive the quote unquote progress the city has made happens to be. Because for those of us who are, you know, regular wage earners, we're not progressing, we're regressing. So I've seen the homeless population of students grow exponentially in the school district of Philadelphia, and it's like unbelievable. You know, maybe 15 years ago, the thought of a homeless student was unheard of, but more and more students are homeless, and we find that they're not just individual students, they're families.
Families,
of students.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
they're families seeking shelter.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I did want to let Nijmie know that we did share the Poor People's Campaign website on our Facebook, and it'll be part of the today's show. And I also wanted to just say that you know, I appreciate you, Nijmie. I appreciate the work that you do. I think that what you do really has been making a difference all the way down to our last election. Because in our last election, we had people elected that the party said, you know, don't vote for. But people rose up and they voted their conscience, right? And I think that part of that has to do with the messaging that you're putting out. And it may not be covered in the mainstream media, but it is, because the issues are there. Because winning is when the mainstream media uses your terminology to explain what the issue is. And as long as your terminology is being used, I don't care whether it's your name, the name of your organization, or your name in particular. As long as they use your voice, you win. So Nijmie, take us out.
No, I just thank you. I just appreciate that. And I really, really appreciate and respect all of you, and thank you for having me and being here, and just tremendous respect for all of your work. I know that a lot of times all the work that we do is, you know, not recognized enough, and we're not thanked enough for what we do. And so I think it's up to us to appreciate each other, to thank each other. So I really want to take a moment just to appreciate all of you and thank all of you so much for everything that you do and have been doing for many, many, many years. It is greatly, greatly, greatly appreciated. And I just want to say thank you so much.
Well,
no, we thank
ahead,
you
Lisa.
for your work.
Definitely. So the other thing that we want to just make sure and let people know that this activity is June the 20th. It is in DC, right? And so if you want to sign up, you'll get the information and to figure out how you can get involved. But more importantly, continue to educate yourself. Educate yourself about the important issues. You know, we have a reality TV president, right? And so we can't allow those billionaires that make decisions about what it is that we should care about control us. So we have to go outside. We have to go outside the mainstream media. We have to do some research ourselves, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to push the envelope to get to where we need to be as a people, so that our kids don't have to deal with the militarization of the police and don't have to fear living in America.
Amen.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. And I'll just say that the June 20th, 2020 is a digital justice gathering, so I just want to make sure everyone knows that is online. You can sign up at poorpeoplescampaign.org, and you can join us in the lead up. There's actually 2 events taking place. One is a digital event. Again, look at PA Poor People's Campaign on Facebook to see that today there's an event on environmental devastation, which will be featuring folks from Philadelphia as well as across the state. And tomorrow there is a car caravan happening in Philly. It's about everybody's got a right to live. We declare Jubilee, and we're meeting up at 13th and Washington at 2 p.m. So we welcome you to join us there as well.
And Aissia, if I could, I just wanted to say that don't forget to vote. Vote by mail made the difference in all of the races in Philly specifically and throughout the state. I mean, we were sitting on pins and needles for 2 weeks to find out who the winners were going to be. So please don't forget to complete the census and to vote and to complete your forms to vote by mail.
Yes, that is incredibly important. Voting is the key to having your voice be heard. You're listening to Voices of Change with Aissia Richardson and Leslie Acosta. We want to send out positive thoughts for the work that Nijmie is doing, the work that Lisa is doing, the work that Denise does daily. And we just want to say how much we appreciate this platform and that we will see you next week. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.